Hello, everyone. LC Holt here, and this is my update for the week of July the 27th. Nearing the end of July, I'm a year older.
Yes.
Rebecca, we'll leave that just lying right on the floor. Instead, we're gonna we're gonna jump over to Rebecca Ivey and our discussion about The Shining, a masterpiece, directed, produced, and co-written by this man, Stanley Kubrick. Really good book.
I gave you that book.
You did, and that's why I brought it up. And I would recommend that anybody who is really interested in this late great director check that book out because a lot of good interview stories about his work ethic and techniques, and also a bunch of really good pictures as well. But like I said, today we're going to be talking about his masterpiece, one of several masterpieces, The Shining. Many people consider it one of the great horror films of all time. Stanley Kubrick himself was trying to make what he said would be the definitive horror film, because that's what he tried to do with every genre that he worked in. He worked in a lot. Whenever Kubrick wanted to do one, he wanted to do the definitive version of whatever the genre was. I don't know if Stephen King necessarily agreed that it was the best horror film ever made. We'll get into that. But it is a adaptation of a book by Stephen King, of course, that was published in 1977 when Stephen King was living in Boulder, Colorado. He moved there because, as any King fan knows, most of his novels were set in Maine. He was looking for a new setting for his next novel. And so what he decided to do was change his locale. So he and his family moved for a year to Colorado. And near Boulder, there was a place called Estes Park. And in Estes Park, there was a hotel called the Stanley Hotel. One weekend, Stephen King and his wife Tabitha went to stay at the Stanley. It was off season, so they were there pretty much by themselves. In fact, they had to pay with cash because the credit card machine was already down for the year. And so they decided to take a room in the empty Stanley Hotel. Ate dinner that night in a restaurant attached that all the chairs were up on the table. They were the only two people eating there. And King walked around the Stanley, the empty corridors of this old hotel, and just sort of took it all in. And then that night, he said that he had a dream while he and his wife were sleeping in their room about his 3-year-old son running through the halls of the hotel as if he was being chased by something. And so Stephen King woke up with this dream fresh in his mind, and he sat next to the window and he grabbed a pencil and just started jotting down. He said in just a few seconds he had come up with the basic structure of what the book The Shining was going to be. And so that is bare bones how this story came to Stephen King's mind. He wrote the book, and then, it was published. Now, Stephen King obviously is a very fast writer. I mean, him and Anne Rice, I'm just in awe of, because Stephen King can write the first draft of a novel in 3 months. Anne Rice actually prefers to write the first drafts of her novels in 6 weeks. Can you believe that? I mean, I, like I say, I'm in awe. As a writer myself, in total awe of their ability to tell stories like that. Stanley Kubrick is a director at this point who had done many, many classic films already. Lolita, The Killing, Dr. Strangelove, 2001: A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, and more recently, Barry Lyndon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Barry Lyndon, have you ever seen Barry Lyndon?
It's been a long time ago.
It's a very slow movie.
Yeah.
It's not the most exciting film. In terms of, pictorially, it's amazing because every angle, every shot looks like a Victorian era painting. I mean, it's gorgeous to look at. But it's also, 3 hours long. And
I've heard people say that about, being very slow, Space Odyssey. I've had friends say that they say it's very hard to focus.
I mean, I can see that to some extent, but I mean,
Up to a certain point.
at least with Space Odyssey, it is kind of like three different movies. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, it's like the Gorilla Dawn of Time
Mhm.
section, and then there's like the Going to the Moon section, and then there's like the final section on the ship. You know, with Hal. Barry Lyndon is really just, it's all about the life of the man Barry Lyndon. And it's one story, constant all the way through. And I've since in my life come to appreciate it more as I've gotten older and as I've watched it more. The first time I watched it with Kubrick's other films in mind, I am, as you can tell from the book, a Kubrick fan. I had a reaction very similar to the contemporary audiences of when it came out, and thinking that it was really, really tedious to get through. It was not a successful movie. And Kubrick reacted to this by thinking, well, I want to do things that artistically fulfill me. But at the same time, I need to do something commercially viable for my next film. And so, taking that stance, he started to look for books to adapt that would give him a more commercially viable end product. And what he did was he just bought up a lot of books, and his secretary would bring him stacks of books into his office. And the story is that every few minutes the secretary would hear another book bang against the wall. That Kubrick would read the first few pages, and if he just didn't get engaged in it, he would just throw it and grab the next book on the pile. And eventually the secretary said she stopped hearing the bangs. And she went into his office, and he was reading The Shining by Stephen King. And that was how Stanley Kubrick chose this particular ghost story as the source material for his next film. Now, Stephen King had the rights in his contract for The Shining to compose a first draft screenplay, which he did. Kubrick read it and disregarded it. He didn't like the screenplay in terms of something that he would want to do. So maybe that was part of why Stephen King got off on a bad foot with the film. I don't know, that they rejected his screenplay, or that Kubrick rejected his screenplay. Diane Johnson, a novelist that Kubrick admired, was hired to write the script along with Kubrick himself. They would talk, as Kubrick usually did, over the course of many, many months. He would go back and forth with whoever the writer was on his film, and they would write drafts separately, go back and then send it, and then they would talk about it. And Kubrick was very perfectionistic, as anybody who knows anything about Kubrick knows. He did not take any element of the film for granted. Everything was meticulously thought out and designed, which is why he did so few movies in his lifetime, because it would take him years and years. I mean, Full Metal Jacket, for instance, took 2.5 years to get a screenplay that he liked. So that's just writing the script. So on The Shining, he went back and forth with Diane Johnson until he got a script that he liked. Now, it's not that he, totally canceled Stephen King out of the process, because Stephen King would often get calls in the middle of the night from Stanley Kubrick, because Kubrick lived in England. King, of course, lived in, at this point, he was living in Maine again in the United States. And Kubrick would call him up and say things like, do you believe in God? And Stephen King would give his answer, and then Kubrick would say, oh, okay. And he would hang up. So that would be these odd conversations in the middle of the night. One time, Kubrick called up and said to Stephen King, don't you believe that the idea of life after death is inherently optimistic? And Stephen King said, well, what about hell? And Stanley Kubrick said, I don't believe in hell. Click. And so this was the kind of conversations that would go on between them at odd hours of the night, when obviously,
Say, King's probably like, quit calling me with these great questions.
Yeah. And King he visited the set once they were shooting. It's not like, again, Kubrick didn't totally just lock him out of the project. King would talk about him and Stanley Kubrick walking around on the back lot of Elstree Studios where The Shining was filmed, and Stanley, excuse me, was a smoker, as am I, which might
I was about to
explain
say,
why.
much like yourself, yes.
Right. Hence why I had to take a glass of water there, sip of water. But Kubrick was a smoker, and King would talk about how when Kubrick would finish a cigarette, he'd take the filter of the cigarette and he'd roll it around in his fingers and until it was just a perfect little ball that he would make out of these filters. And King said that Kubrick would take a Sucrets can out of his jacket pocket, open it up, and there'd be all these little balls that had been made out of cigarette filters, and he'd put the next one in there, close it, and put it back in his pocket. And all this while he was talking about some kind of a technical aspect of making the movie and stuff. So they had an interesting rapport, the two of them. It sounds like a lot of quirkiness going back and forth there. But let's talk for a second about the casting. We've talked about the script and sort of the inception of the book and everything. Jack Nicholson was Kubrick's first choice to play the character of Jack Torrance, the tortured playwright who goes to spend the off season by himself with his family, his wife and his small child, at the fictional Overlook Hotel. Several people were considered, as well as Jack Nicholson, because as was generally the case with Kubrick, he might have an idea of what he wanted at first, but he left it open and experimented with other ideas. Robert De Niro, for instance, was someone who was considered. Robert De Niro supposedly said that when he saw the movie The Shining after it was over with, that it gave him nightmares for months. Have you ever had a nightmare based on a movie?
Probably when I was a kid.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't recall having ever watched a movie and gotten a nightmare because of a movie. I mean, I've had nightmares, certainly. That's obviously we all have. But I've never had a nightmare that was inspired by a movie.
Mine was Gremlins. I saw Gremlins, and then I went to sleep, and I dreamt the Gremlins came into our house. That was it.
Really?
Yeah.
In some ways, I kind of envy that, like people who have watch Nightmare on Elm Street and then have a nightmare about Freddy Krueger coming after them. I'm like, wow, so you kind of got to have your own movie going there. I wish I could. Now, that's never happened to me. But Robin Williams was another person that was considered for Jack Torrance. So what do you think about that?
That's an interesting choice.
And this would be in the late 70s. So it'd be Robin Williams. Yeah, around the time of Popeye, and Mork and Mindy. And, of course, Harrison Ford was considered. What do you think about that?
I mean, yeah, but kind of, I don't know.
See, I could see Harrison Ford maybe playing the character as he was written in the novel.
Yeah.
Because a big bone of contention with Stephen King about the character of Jack Torrance in the film was that if you read the novel is very much it's the story of Jack Torrance, and it's the story of how he became ultimately who he becomes. He's a normal guy who loves his wife and his child. He has a drinking problem, which he is apparently genetically predisposed to have from his own father, who was an alcoholic and an abusive man. This is all in the novel. And then throughout the course of the novel, which goes deeply into Jack's past, the way about how he was a private school teacher at an academy in Maine, and he had a run-in with a student. He gave the student a bad grade, and the student slashed his tire, and Jack caught the student in the process of doing that, and being kind of in a half-drunken rage, beat the kid up. And so he lost his job at the private school. And of course, what is mentioned in the movie is an incident in which he had been drinking. He came home and he found Danny, his young son, had strode his papers that he was writing across the room. And in an angry moment, he grabbed the kid's arm and pulled him up, but he pulled him too hard and broke Danny's arm. And that almost cost him his marriage with his wife, Wendy, who in the novel is giving Jack a second chance as he's now gone into basically he's become like a dry drunk. He's not going through any sort of Alcoholics Anonymous or anything. He's trying to quit cold turkey. And a lot of the book is about his problem attempting to quit alcohol on his own and still kind of fighting the battle of his past, his relationship with his father. So as I said, it goes very, very deeply into the Jack Torrance character. And I think that perhaps Stephen King, who himself struggled with alcoholism and which he is admitted to certain violent tendencies brought on by alcoholism in his own life, I think that this book really was a personal statement of his. And so when they decided to make the movie, and they disregarded a lot of that everyman sort of aspect to Jack, and didn't really deal with the realistic ideas of alcoholism and delving into that. I mean, Jack Torrance in the movie is certainly an alcoholic who is trying to quit cold turkey. That is intact. But it doesn't really go into where the sort of the impetus of the alcoholism came from, his own relationship with his father. And it doesn't really deal with him trying to clean up from King's point of view. Yeah. And I think that was really a bone of contention for him. Because if you look at some of the choices Stephen King had suggested to Kubrick for who could play Jack, they're very much in that everyman kind of vein. He suggested people like John Voight. Stephen King had suggested Christopher Reeve to be Jack, Michael Moriarty, people like that. And like I said before, Harrison Ford to me would kind of fit into that everyman vein. Like I could see him playing the book version of Jack. King's biggest problem with Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance was he said that the arc of the character as he was presented in the script and then through Jack Nicholson's performance was non-existent. He said that Jack is he's kind of off balance from the beginning, and so he just gets a little more off balance by the end, but there's not a huge change. And I can, as big of a fan as I am of The Shining, I can understand King's point of view there to an extent. Because when you see Jack, like the first time he's with the family, Wendy and Danny, driving up Sidewinder to the hotel, he already seems irritated by these people. He's not like a loving father trying to get himself in shape and everything. And then there's this kind of tragedy of him falling. He's already kind of pissed, it looks like, Yeah. So I can see to some extent what he's talking about there. I was mentioning the other family members, Wendy, the wife, who wound up being played by Shelley Duvall, the world's greatest olive oil.
Yes.
Speaking of the Popeye movie, I don't know if you could have any better casting than Shelley Duvall as olive oil in the Popeye film. And then it's interesting because an actor who started with Stanley Kubrick on Barry Lyndon, Leon Vitali, became, up until the end of Kubrick's life, his assistant on the set of all of his movies. So he started with Kubrick as an actor, and then Leon Vitali became his assistant. There's a great documentary in which Leon Vitali tells his life story and tells what it was like really working with Stanley Kubrick and being friends with him throughout the whole of Kubrick's life after Barry Lyndon. And so Leon Vitali, as assistant to Kubrick on The Shining, he oversaw the casting of the little boy Danny. And they went through a pool of 5,000 boys. And Kubrick was very specific about he wanted to draw from areas like Chicago and Denver and Cincinnati, because he thought that if you got a child from those parts of the world, or the country rather, that the child's accent would match the accents of the actors he cast to play the parents. So he was very specific about the child speaking in such a way that you would believe that he was raised by Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. That's how particular he was. And the person they eventually hired was a little boy named Danny Lloyd. So you had Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance, and you had Danny Lloyd as Danny. So there you didn't have to. When you called out Jack, you knew Jack was going to answer, and the same for the boy. Now, the film was not shot on location. It was shot on sound stages. It is set in Colorado, where the Overlook is supposedly located. It was not shot in Colorado because Kubrick did not like to travel in planes. He had set up his home base in England, and all of his movies past a certain point were shot in England. He did send out second unit crews headed by his producer and brother-in-law, Jan Harlan, to America, to a hotel that Kubrick had chosen called the Timberland Lodge in Oregon, which had this really interesting exterior design, architecture really distinctive. And when you see the movie, you see that the Timberland Lodge as the exterior. And it's an iconic looking hotel, you know. I think it was a great choice, just aesthetically, because it looks like, because in the movie they talk a lot about the Native American background. There's a lot of Native American rugs, and they talk about how the hotel was built on an Indian burial ground. So all this stuff, when you look at the design of that Timberland Lodge, it sort of plays into that slightly, it kind of looks like it has a slightly Native American feel to it, just in the building of how it's built. And then they shot other little things in America, like where the Volkswagen is driving up the Sidewinder. That was shot with helicopters near Yosemite National Park. But most of the stuff I would say all of the stuff with the actual actors were shot on sound stages at Elstree Studio in England. And they built the interior of the Overlook in the studio. It was the biggest set build of all time up until that point at Elstree Studio. So if you walked into these stages, there was the Overlook Hotel, the entire interior. And the way Kubrick had it built, you could start in the foyer and walk down the hall into the manager's office, into Ullman's office. And then you could go back down into that big room, like the lounge room where Jack is typing on his typewriter. And then you could go around the corner and into the kitchen. So everything was connected. It was as if he built the inside of a hotel in this soundstage. The hedge maze was also built inside the soundstage, even though it is technically an exterior location. And even more than that, they built a facade of the Timberland Lodge, the outside of the Timberland Lodge. They built that outside Elstree Studio. So when you see the characters walking in front of the hotel that looks like the hotel from the helicopter shot at the beginning, it's not that hotel. It's actually a replica, a scale replica of the outside of that hotel. So, I mean, it very meticulous as always. Stanley Kubrick was very, very good about that kind of stuff. The hedge maze, of course, is not really at the Timberland Lodge. So when you see the helicopter shot at the beginning, there is no hedge maze outside. But when you see later, there is a hedge maze there, which has led a lot of people into many, many theories about The Shining in terms of how much of it is inside the head of characters, what is actually there, what is not. I mean, we could do hours of shows about documentaries that have been made about The Shining, in which people have tried to posit theories that somehow Kubrick is admitting that he directed the faked space landing, moon landing rather, and that The Shining is this confession of how he did it. And it's like baffling. It's baffling that this ghost story, this horror movie, has so many kind of conspiracy theories wrapped into it about the moon landing and all this kind of stuff. I mean, have you ever seen any of those documentaries?
I haven't seen the documentaries, but I've heard of the moon landing theory, and I've heard about it, but I've never seen the documentaries on it.
Yeah. Some of them are kind of fascinating. Some of them, I'll be honest with you, I kind of have actively avoided simply because I'm like, I don't want to
Sort
get
of
it.
like the Paul is Dead documentary that was on Netflix that time. Remember? I sent
Yes.
you the thing trying to tell you about it.
Yeah. Is that
Yeah.
still on there?
I don't know. That's been several years ago. I don't know if it's still on there, but it was.
It was a good documentary. The reason I would say if it's still on there, you should check it out if you
Yeah.
haven't. Um, Now, the hedge maze in the movie is not in the book. In the book, they're topiary animals. The hedges are formed into wolves and giraffes and various things, and those animals seem to move on their own. And that's a really interesting idea. Kubrick did not want to go that route, though. I don't think he wanted like the hedges to be animals that moved and growled and stuff. That was a little too much, I think, a little too over the top for Kubrick. Which some people have kind of stated that Kubrick was more into the psychological aspects rather than the haunting, the actual idea of a haunting. Go ahead. What were you saying?
Oh, I was going to say that makes me think of the mini series.
Which we'll get
Yeah,
into.
which
Yeah.
you'd see it move and then cut to commercial.
Right. We're going to get into that miniseries, I tell you.
Um, you didn't bring this up. I don't know if you're waiting or if I may be mistaken, but I've also heard that the John Lennon song "Instant Karma" kind of inspired.
You're right.
Because he says we all shine on.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That was where Stephen King got the idea of shining, calling telepathy that the characters have shining is from that John Lennon song. Absolutely right. And as you mentioned that, we should say like I say, the two of you that don't know, The Shining references something that the character, the cook, Dick Halloran says. He says that when he was a child, his grandmother had this psychic ability. He has it himself, and that the grandmother used to call people who had this ability that they could shine. I mean, that's sort of the euphemism for telepathy, is that the person shines. And so Halloran tells this to Danny, who himself has this ability, and says that you can shine too. And so Danny kind of takes that sort of phraseology and uses it to refer to whenever he uses the telepathic ability. And the idea is that his telepathic ability is allowing him to see things at the hotel that are that are there in some sort of an ethereal sense. That's more in the book, I think, than in the movie, because in the movie there is this idea of is it all in Jack's head? How much of this is because Jack is just losing his mind? How much of it is real? Which, to me, I think when I watch the movie that the ghosts are real. Because at the end, Wendy also sees them. Remember when she's running through the hotel and she sees the infamous like giant teddy bear guy who's giving head to the dude from the party, and you're like, what the hell? And then it goes on to something else. She sees the skeletons in the sort of the ballroom there. So that suggests to me that either Wendy has the shining, or that it couldn't just be all in Jack's mind. And one of the things that's kind of interesting, and King goes into it more in the sequel novel, Doctor Sleep, was the idea that both Wendy and Jack also had this ability. And that maybe the reason Danny has it so strongly is because both of his parents had it to a lesser degree, or perhaps when Jack Torrance was younger, he had it strongly. And then as he got older, it faded, because in the books, it is suggested that you do lose it as you get older. At least you lose your ability to use it effectively. And so if that's the case, then the reason Wendy and Jack are experiencing what they experience in the Overlook could be because they have this ability that their son has. It's just they don't have it to as high a degree, so they're not experiencing it quite as heavily as he is. With the exception, obviously, of Jack, who sees quite a few very unusual things. Lloyd the bartender, in which he has a great conversation, the whole sequence in the Kubrick film where Lloyd takes him into the bathroom and tells him essentially, as he's trying to clean a drink off of Jack's jacket, that, you know, what he's going to have to do, which is murder his wife and his son, you know, to correct them. In a great scene, written and directed by Kubrick, which appears in a certain form in the book, but a lot of that is very Kubrickian, the way it plays out. The work days on this movie were very, very long, as was generally the case with Stanley Kubrick films. And the shooting took over a year, which is usually the case with Stanley Kubrick films. As I said before, he didn't skimp on the writing, and he definitely didn't skip on the filming. I mean, he wanted everything perfect, down to, you know, there were many, many actors who talked about the hundreds and hundreds of takes Kubrick would do before he would finally decide on something. He would print all, not all necessarily, but a lot of these takes. So he would have all these different options. Some people even said that he did this in order to break down the actors, in a sense, to make them not act and just get them so exhausted that the words were just coming out of their mouths, which led into that sort of Kubrickian style of acting that you see in his movies, where the actors are, there is a certain, even no matter who the actor is, whether it's Tom Cruise in Eyes Wide Shut or Shelley Duvall in The Shining, they do kind of act differently than they do in other movies. And perhaps that's because of how Stanley Kubrick is working with them and how he's making them go through many, many, many takes. I know that Shelley Duvall did not get along with Kubrick. This is a pretty famous story now. It's not like I'm revealing something untoward, but yeah, Kubrick, he was not very sympathetic to Shelley Duvall, who apparently was getting sick during shooting, was so stressed out. She said her hair was coming out in clumps, and I don't know how much is true, because I once saw an interview with Shelley Duvall where she was talking about being around Jack Nicholson on the set, which, you know, Jack Nicholson had done Easy Rider. He had done One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He'd done Five Easy Pieces. He was like this big deal in the late 70s. And so a lot of attention was going to Jack. And Shelley said that, you know, sometimes maybe she wanted attention too in these interviews. So when you hear her say stuff like that, it makes you wonder how much of this illness and tomfoolery was actually happening, and how much was just her trying to get attention from Jack, you know, or from trying to steal attention from Jack. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. You never know.
It's interesting. It's very interesting. I would love to have seen what, you know, we were talking about on a Marilyn Monroe show. Could you imagine Marilyn Monroe and Stanley Kubrick doing a movie together? It never would get made. It would never get made. Never be finished.
I don't know. I mean, I guess when she looked over at her acting coach, and the acting coach went, "That was a good take." Yeah, she'd probably done. I don't know. But then again, she was I think part of that was, you know, people talk about her insecurities. I think she was just such a perfectionist in that way. I mean, I know she always forgot her lines and stuff, but I think a lot of it had to do with this idea that she had of what she needed to be. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, well, and that's part of why I say I don't think a film with the two of them would have worked. I just don't see two people who are perfectionists ever ending up well in this sort of a situation. You know, I mean, Kubrick would have probably been shooting that movie until he died. You know, because a lot of people on the set, like Jack Nicholson, got to a point where he was just like, there were so many rewrites from day to day. They would give him a script and he would go, well, by this afternoon, it'll be different. So he'd just throw it away. So most of the lines that you see in the movie, Jack memorized them a couple minutes before they shot, because he was like, there's no point in memorizing these scripts. There's too many.
By the time you got to the take that they wanted to keep, you'd have it memorized.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like you're going to do one take, one and done.
Yeah.
So yeah,
most of the day will be rehearsal. So
yeah,
on film, rehearsal on film.
And that was part of that was the tack Nicholson took in this. Kubrick with Duvall again was just, he would always criticize her like acting technique, and he would, if people tried to sympathize with her, you can see some footage where like Kubrick's daughter was taking video or film at that time of the set. And Kubrick's daughter, I guess, was trying to like kind of pet Shelley Duvall when she was upset about something, and you could hear Kubrick off camera going, "Don't sympathize with her. Don't sympathize with Shelley," and he would walk off. So it was pretty contentious. Now the typewriter. Let's talk about some of the iconic scenes in The Shining, shall we? One of the most iconic is, of course, the scene with the typewriter, where Shelley, as Wendy, comes into the room with the baseball bat, and she sees what Jack has been typing all this time. She thinks he's typing a book because he's been in there tapping away for long periods of time. Jack is experiencing writer's block, which is causing even more problems on top of the fact that he's on a dry drunk, tossing his tennis ball against the wall and then sitting at the typewriter going at it. She discovers that what he's been typing this whole time is the same line over and over and over again. This is a Kubrick addition. This isn't exactly in the script with Stephen King. Kubrick put it in. And what was interesting about it is Kubrick did all the shots of the actual sheets of paper were done using different languages for different countries. So he didn't just shoot the English language version of what you saw. He shot it in German, he shot it in Spanish, he shot it in French. Not only that, but each of the different phrases that he had repeated, over and over again were different phrases. They weren't all, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, which is what's on the English language version. They were idioms that would be specific to the country in which the language was written for. So that's kind of, again, it goes back to how specific he was about everything. I think the Spanish version was no matter how early you get up, the sun rises no sooner. Like the German version was never put off for tomorrow, which you could do today. So it was just these different idioms from different countries. And depending on where you were watching the movie, that was the version you got of what she was looking at on the sheets of paper. So I feel for whoever the person was that had to sit there and type all of those things in all those different languages, because there are many, many pages full of this sort of stuff. Another iconic thing was the woman in room 237, which in the book it's room 217, but in the movie it's room 237. That was changed because the one demand that the Timberland Lodge people had for using their hotel as the exterior, they said, we actually have a room 217. So if you would, change the room number, please, of where the woman is dead in the bathtub. And so Kubrick obliged. And so he changed, one of the numerals, and it became room 237 in the film, because the Timberland Lodge did not have a room 237. That's an interesting one. That's one of those scenes that a lot of people talk about, where Jack Nicholson goes into the room after his son was apparently attacked by a woman. The son says he was attacked. The mother thinks that either one of two things. There's a crazy person who's somehow gotten through the snow and has gotten into the hotel and is there with them, or in the back of her mind, a fear that comes more into the light shortly thereafter. She believes that maybe Jack did this to their kid, that in his, whatever sort of emotional breakdown he's having, he attacked Danny again. Because the little boy has evidence of being attacked. There are handprints on his neck and so forth, and his shirt's torn. So Jack goes into the room that the little boy says the woman is in, and he finds this beautiful woman in the bathtub, naked. And then the woman walks over to him, and they start to, mac a little bit. And then the woman turns into a rotting old corpse and starts coming after him. And until Jack manages to get out of the room, lock the door, and back away. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think of that scene?
It's pretty creepy.
One of your all-time favorites of all time, isn't
Yeah.
it? But anyway, yeah, that was an interesting. That is from the book. That happens in the book. There's more discussion in the book about who the woman is, that she had committed suicide in the room and that kind of thing. In the movie, you don't really know who the woman is. She's just a ghost in the hotel. And there are numerous other things like that in the book that are explained, such as, the murder of a gangster who was shotgunned in the presidential suite. That's not really in the movie. None of that kind of stuff is mentioned. There apparently were mentions of some of these specific events that happened over the years at the Overlook in scenes that were cut out of the movie. Because at one point you see Jack at the typewriter, he has a scrapbook open, but there were scenes in which you saw Jack finding the scrapbook and going through articles of horrible things that had happened in the past at the hotel. All that was cut out of the film. But as I said, in one scene, you can actually see it sitting there open, but you don't know really what it is in the movie. The elevator doors opening and the blood spilling out. That is a scene that is, again, iconic. Not in the book. That is a Kubrick edition. And what an incredible edition it was, because everybody remembers the elevator doors opening and the blood coming out. I actually had a relative who said that when she could never watch The Shining in color. For some reason, the blood was less scary to her in black and white. So she would turn the color off of the television in order to watch The Shining, so that she didn't see the blood coming out, the red blood. It's interesting. The first movie I did with Adam Wingard, one of his bits of direction was based entirely on that scene with the elevator in The Shining. There's a scene in that movie where I come out of an office and I have this axe and I'm going after somebody who I think is trying to kill me, and it's shot at high speed, so it's slow motion. And you see me come out of the office and run toward the camera and jump up and everything. And Wingard told me, he said, when you come out of the room, I want you to come out of the room as if you were the blood coming out of the elevators in The Shining. And I was like, oh, okay, I got you. And so I even did like a little jump, because when the blood hits the wall and it splashes up, like that was my version of the blood hitting the wall and splashing up. I don't know if anybody watching Homesick got that reference, but that was actually something that we were referencing. Now, another infamous scene was the scene where Jack Nicholson chops through the door coming after his wife. I saw a hilarious GIF, which I'm going to have to send you.
Okay.
A cartoon version of that scene that made me laugh so hard. It is so iconic. It has become GIFs and memes, and they use it as clips during award shows. Jack Nicholson, who incidentally was a volunteer firefighter at one point in his life, was very good with an axe, and actually chopped through the first door too quickly and too easily. So they tried to find a heavier, thicker door and to put so he didn't get through it so quickly. And so that's what you see in the movie, is you see the heavier door, the one that's taking him a little more time to chop through, because I don't think they were as aware of how good he was chopping through doors when they did it the first time. But anyway, he chops through the door, and of course he gives the famous line, "Here's Johnny," which is a reference to The Tonight Show at the time. It was a Jack Nicholson ad lib. Something similar happens in the book, only in the book, instead of an axe, Jack has a polo mallet, and that's what he goes after his family with. And he chops through the door and he says "boo" to his wife instead of "here's Johnny." So it's a different line. I like the "here's Johnny" bit. I think it's really fun for the movie. And, by this point, Nicholson is just full tilt. He's going all full out crazy. Briefly, though, I wanted to mention Garrett Brown, because Garrett Brown was a Steadicam operator. He was the man who invented the Steadicam, incidentally. And Kubrick wanted to use the Steadicam on The Shining. It had been used previously, but never been used to such an extent as it would be used in this film. There is a hell of a lot of Steadicamming in The Shining, whether it be following Danny and Jack as they run through the hedge maze at the end, or whether it be, Danny on his tricycle going around in the rooms, going through all the different halls. All of that stuff was utilizing the Steadicam. And for those of you who don't know, Steadicam was a new invention at the time. Then everybody uses it now, but it allowed you to move the camera with the actors without having to lay dolly tracks, without having to use cranes. It is a device that's worn on an operator, and no matter what kind of terrain the operator is moving over, because of the balance of the Steadicam itself, the shot is smooth. So it looks like you're on a dolly track, only you don't need the dolly, which saves you a hell of a lot of time and a hell of a lot of energy laying all that track. And also, there are certain areas you can't get a dolly into. With a Steadicam, if a man can get into that area, then the Steadicam can get into that area. So you didn't have to worry about building the door frames wider to get the dolly through. You didn't have to worry about all that. You could just, if a guy could walk through the door, the Steadicam could go through the door. And Kubrick used it, as I said, to tremendous effect. The movie was originally screened in two major cities, New York and Los Angeles. Okay, and May 23rd, 1980. That he began to screen the movie. He pulled his own movie a week after the screenings began because he wanted to make additional cuts, which he did. Kubrick cut 25 extra minutes out of the movie, which are now lost because when Kubrick cut stuff, deleted scenes, takes he didn't want to use, Kubrick incinerated all that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. He did not keep that stuff hanging around for posterity, for DVDs in the future and all that shit. He got rid of it. If he didn't want you to see the movie, he wanted you to see the movie exactly the way he intended you to, which is why you don't see a lot of DVD extras on Kubrick's films, because the shit don't exist anymore. There was an ending that was removed after the film was officially released that has never really been seen by anybody since, in which you see Wendy after they escape the hotel in a hospital. The manager, Mr. Allman, comes to her, and there's a sort of a sense that Allman is himself a ghost. And Danny is sitting outside the hospital room, and the little tennis ball rolls up to him, suggesting that maybe the ghosts have followed them out of the hotel. All of that was ultimately extraneous. They didn't use it in the movie. So the movie ends with that mysterious photograph of Jack at a party in 1921, which harkens back to a line spoken earlier by the character of Grady, in which he says, "You have always been the caretaker here," which is a very mysterious line. It's a very mysterious shot. It leaves the film on an ambiguous note. You wonder, what does that mean? So Jack was there in 1921. He was always here. He was always the caretaker. As Kubrick tended to do, he loved to ask questions that did not necessarily have answers, at least not answers he was going to share with anybody. Maybe this was another reason Stephen King didn't like the movie. Stephen King is a moralist. In a lot of his stories, he is an absolute moralist. And at the end of the story, the good guy either wins or they don't. The bad guy succeeds or they don't. King has very definitive endings. He has used ambiguity, but never in such an extent like Stanley Kubrick did in the film of The Shining. So that might be another reason that King, when the film ended with that photograph, King might have been like, what the fuck? Who knows? And maybe that's why he didn't love the movie that much ultimately. I don't know. I can't say for sure. I do know that Stephen King over the years has gotten a little bit better. He's softened up a little bit about The Shining. Like, he's not quite so adamantly against it now as he was then. But I think he still prefers his book, and he probably still prefers the miniseries from 1997. Which starred Steven Weber from Wings fame.
Yes, that's all I kept thinking when I watched it. It's like, they got the guy from Wings?
Yeah. Rebecca De Mornay plays Wendy. I actually like her performance as Wendy in the miniseries. That I will give. I do think she's a much stronger character than the Shelley Duvall version in Kubrick's. And then Cortlandt Mead, otherwise known as the boy who cannot close his mouth, plays Danny in the miniseries. I do not believe that he was an improvement. And I can say that now because he's an adult. I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings. I'm not picking on a child anymore. But he was not very well cast. Um, but the miniseries follows the book more closely.
But this was something, because I remember we used to sit around and read the Stephen King, his scripts. But the kids were always so corny in his scripts. I remember us discussing that. The kids were always, the dad and son stuff was always a little bit more cornier.
I agree.
Kids were always like, golly gee whiz. And you're like, what kid talks like that?
Well, I mean, like the Pet Sematary film, and I'm probably going to ruffle some feathers if anybody's watching this long into this video. I might ruffle your feathers right now and say that I am not a huge fan of Pet Sematary, the film. It was written by Stephen King, the screenplay was. I think it has some great aspects to it, but I do think there's some terrible writing in that screenplay. The little girl who's always like, yay! I'm like, Steve, your kids were like that? That's really irritating.
The thing is you can get away with more in a book than you can in a screenplay. It's I mean, you might be a writer, but writing it's as your economics teacher said, apples and oranges.
Yes.
Guns and butter.
Guns and butter. Absolutely. And butter. It's absolutely guns and butter when you talk about screenplays and novels. You make a great point. The redundancy sometimes in Stephen King's novels in terms of phrases that are repeated work very well because there's like 20,000 words between the two times the phrases are repeated. When you get into films and you have a character like, say, the little boy in the miniseries adaptation of Desperation, who every 5 seconds is saying, God, God, this was God's plan. God, God. And you're like, okay, Steve, I get it. The kid's a Jesus freak. He doesn't have to say every single line. I mean, sometimes what's not said is as important as what is said. The little girl in Pet Sematary who just is so irritating. She says, the whole bit about, well, why doesn't God get his own cat? You're like, shut up, kid. I mean, I don't relate to you. And I'm glad I don't have a child like that. It just comes across as cheesy and whiny. The miniseries of The Shining at the end is really maudlin, really sappy when Danny is graduating and the ghost of his father appears, and it's like, your kisses, that's what I've been missing. And I'm like, oh God, that's so cheesy. Give me a break. It's like barf. Barf.
And then something moves, cut to Charmin commercial.
That was irritating.
Remember, it was never like, someone would talk and that would fade to black. It was always someone talk, they'd leave the frame, and it would just stay there. And then, like, something would move seriously. Cut to Charmin commercial. Every
commercial break on that miniseries always had that happen. It's exactly as you're describing. They'd be having a scene, somebody would walk off frame, and like you said, something would move, fade. And then you knew the next commercial break, the exact same thing was happening. It's as if you had to remind the audience every 10 minutes, remember, this place is haunted. And it just became a little much. Like, the depiction of Tony in the miniseries where he's like floating teenager, it looked really cheesy. It looked bad. The depiction of him in the Kubrick film, is iconic. The little boy that lives inside my mouth. If you open your mouth, can I see him? No. Why not? Because he hides in my stomach. All that stuff is really iconic. But when you just have in the miniseries this, kid with glasses floating like back and forth in midair, it doesn't look good. It's cheesy. And then you find out at the end that Tony is actually Danny from the future, having grown up. That's not in the book, incidentally. That was something King added to his own miniseries, which I don't know how that worked very well. So aside from all the cheesy sentimentality, sort of the finger down your throat, maudlin shit, you had, the topiary animals, as you said, are in there. They look very much like late 90s television.
Television CGI.
Yeah.
Yes.
They don't look, it's hard to buy it, maybe if they had used animatronics, that would have worked better. Like if you had just seen it move its head like a Stan Winston
But
type thing.
you also have to think, these mini-series things were like big events in the 90s, and they'd always want to like try to do like cutting edge technology rather than, oh, does this look good or not? No, we don't care. We want cutting edge. We've spent all this money because it's a big event.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
They all did that,
And especially those ABC King miniseries. Because remember, it was like every year there for a while, you got a new ABC Stephen King miniseries.
Yeah.
Because this was The Shining was one of several that came before and after.
And then you had did NBC do all like the Merlin and the Gulliver's Trap, like all that stuff as well was kind of the same thing. We gotta put all the money into this, but it's gonna be TV quality, but
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's never as good as something you would see at a theater. I mean, even in the effects, they look like TV effects. I mean, they're just a step up from Star Trek: The Next Generation. In fact, some of that in the early '90s looked better than some of the stuff in The Shining, to me personally. And they usually did not have a lot of subtlety.
Yeah, no.
A lot of those TV miniseries, The Shining included, would take the hammer of what the story was trying to portray and just start banging you over your head with it. And the only interruption you got from that was the Charmin commercials. And
yeah, and the thing with this miniseries, it's 3 hours of that. It's over, or 4 hours.
Or yeah.
Yeah.
That was long.
Over several nights of being banged over the head with the same.
Yeah, bad acting. Well, not terrible acting, but lesser acting, really sentimental shit.
I didn't really like the guy from Wings. He really annoyed me.
I think you could have gotten I see where they were going with the everyman type thing, but you could have gotten a better everyman.
Mm-hmm. Scott Bakula?
Absolutely. Well, and I think the best part about the movie, and I don't mean to be redundant, is Rebecca De Mornay, who does a great job, I think, as Wendy. But that's about as far as I can go with the acting side of things. Other than, the Halloran is good. Elliot Gould plays Ullman as a real asshole, more like he is in the book. He's fine. But yeah, some of the main acting, particularly Danny and perhaps Steven Weber, I think I could have done without in the miniseries. Before our show ends, though, I just want to throw in a little bit about Dr. Sleep, which was the novel, the sequel that Stephen King wrote to his own novel, not to the Stanley Kubrick film. Amazingly, when they made the movie version of Dr. Sleep in 2019, last year, before the world changed irreparably, back when we went to see movies in theaters, Stephen King was completely okay with the director, the writer and director, and Mike Flanagan basing his film version of Dr. No on the Stanley Kubrick film, which again makes you wonder if Stephen King hasn't loosened up a little bit, because even though the book is a sequel to his novel, the movie is a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. So it's very interesting what Mike Flanagan did with Dr. Sleep. He faithfully adapted Stephen King's book while also tying that book into the Kubrick film. So it's almost like he's getting the best of both worlds, out of the Dr. Sleep film, which starred Ewan McGregor as an adult, Dan Torrance. And now, Dan is an alcoholic himself, and he's trying to clean his life up. Only unlike his own father, he's actually getting help with his alcoholism, and he's trying to do it the right way after making many, many poor mistakes in his life. And he comes in the Dr. Sleep, the film and the book. Dan connects with a child who is herself very strong telepathically from a different part of the country. And over a contrivance of events, Dan realizes that there is a roaming bunch of psychic vampires living in RV vans who call themselves the True Knot. and they are immortals. But the only way they can live forever is by sucking what they call the steam out of people who shine. And only people who shine have this steam. And so they kill especially strong children, because as I said before, children are stronger with the shine than adults. Though they will kill adults, but they prefer to take the steam from children because then they can contain it and delve it out over time in order to maintain their own immortalities. Very interesting concept. And so Dan, of course, sets out on a journey to save this little girl from this true knot, because the true knot become aware of her, realize how strong she is, and of course naturally target her. And the film and the book both end up with Dan making his way back to the Overlook Hotel and facing off with the ghosts that are still there. Because over time, Dan has come to realize that what the ghosts in the Overlook really wanted, they wanted him. Because a boy like him who had the shine so powerfully would be like a battery for them and would help maintain their existence and help them come forward into the land of the living more easily. So Dan has always been escaping these ghosts who over time have tried to find him, even as he was an adult. But he was always able to contain them because Halloran showed him how to contain ghosts that were violent toward him by making a mental box and trapping the ghost inside of it. And so he has all these ghosts who have come from the Overlook over the years to try and get him. He's contained them all in his own mind in these boxes, which he eventually uses against members of the True Knot once he lures them to the Overlook in order to destroy them. So basically, Danny uses the ghost from his own past to help destroy this new threat. So it's a very, very interesting book and movie. Have you seen the movie?
I have not seen it yet.
I would recommend it. Mike Flanagan is a really, really good director. He did the writer and director. He did the fantastic Netflix miniseries, The Haunting of Hill House, which I'm a huge fan of the series, and I'm a huge fan of the book by Shirley Jackson. Not connected horribly. I mean, Dr. Sleep is very faithful in adaptation of Stephen King's book. The Haunting of Hill House is not faithful necessarily to Shirley Jackson's novel, but it is, in a way, I think, as good in its own manner. So it's one of those few times I've watched an adaptation of a book that I really liked, thought, wow, this is nothing like the book, but really enjoyed it still, you know?
Yeah.
But I think that's just because Flanagan is a really good director. Dr. Sleep is a little long. It's 2 hours and 30 minutes, which I guess isn't that bad because the last It movie was 3 hours, right? But anyway, it was not hugely successful, maybe in part because of the running time. And there were things I could criticize about it because they show like the Jack Nicholson version of Torrance, only it's not Jack Nicholson. And to me, that sort of took me out of the movie because I'm looking at it going, Henry Thomas is a really good actor, but he's not Jack Nicholson and he doesn't really look like him. I wish that scene had been cut, you know. They have an actress who looks and acts a lot like Shelley Duvall playing Wendy. That didn't bother me as much. But once we got into some of the Overlook sections at the end of Dr. Sleep and you started to see scenes from the original movie kind of replay in a new twisted sort of way, I don't know. I thought it was a little bit too much of a nod. I wish it had been a little more of its own movie without going there at the end. But that's just my kind of passing criticism. Otherwise, I think it's a really good movie. Ewan McGregor, who I like personally, I did the Big Fish movie with him, but who I think is also a really, really good actor. I think is fabulous in the movie. But anyway, that's our show on The Shining and its subsequent other adaptations and sequelizations. Rebecca, thank you for being with me today.
Absolutely.
And next week, of course, we'll be talking about yet another fascinating topic, I'm sure. But until then, I want to thank you all for watching. and ask you to please take care of yourselves.